The Feast. A little girl known as Weeping Jane lived in a house off Righteous Lane. Her eyes were bright and full of light, though often they had tears in sight. 7 times a day this girl would pray, even if it was a stormy day. She poured her whole heart out with tears, confessing sins and forsaking fears. One day as Weeping Jane did pray, another girl came walking down her way. This dear little girl named Judith Ann approached dear Jane and held her hand. Judith Ann looked deep into Jane's eyes and asked, "Why is it that you cry?" Weeping Jane, with tears flowing strong, said, "Because for Christ my heart does long." "Please tell me more of what you've seen, so that I might from your treasures glean," said Judith Ann with heart ablaze, while looking at Jane with a steadfast gaze. Weeping Jane then sat down in a chair and said, "Last night's dream I shall share, for this is why I weep this day, because I desire that all would choose Christ's way. As I did dream, I saw 2 young girls. One had straight long hair, the other had curls. They traveled together with purses in hand, and had come before a small town to stand. The 2 girls had heard of a great feast, held for a marriage by a great high priest. They both desired to attend this event, for they heard that it lasted for an eternity spent. The signs that pointed to this great feast pointed right through a town that sat to the east. With zeal to hurry and not be late, they quickly ran up to the town's brass gates. There at the gates of this small town stood a very tall man in a spotless white gown. He welcomed them in on past the gates and said, "Here is where you determine your fate." He took his staff that rested in his hand and pointed to all the town's stores and land. "If you're looking for the feast, then you must go through this town. But before your arrival, you must find a white gown." He said all who desire to attend the Lamb's great dinner will need to first be washed and changed, if he be a sinner. He then looked down, and with a grave face, he warned, "Remember though, run as only one wins the race. For not everyone that searches for this feast so grand will make it there prepared with a white garment in hand. Some will find distractions that fancy their hearts, and some from this mission will even depart. Others will be loaded down with cares and miss this feast with their many snares. But those dear few who prepare diligently will arrive at the feast after searching intently." The little girl with curls asked the man in white, "Where can I buy such a garment so bright?" The tall man replied, "Its cost has been paid. They are given free to all who truly desire to be arrayed. You must first find for yourself the great high priest, the Son who is calling all to this feast, and there receive freely a garment to dress after he washes you clean with his holiness." The 2 girls both nodded and were on their way. Quickly running and searching without delay, they ran past the many storefronts, searching for a garment as if in a treasure hunt. Then, as they came to a colorful store, they stopped their race and approached the door. The little girl with long straight hair said, "This is a candy store, surely a snare." But the little girl with curls on her head ignored the advice and went in instead. Inside she gathered her purse full of treats, while her friend steadfastly continued down the street. The little girl with curls came out of the store, then continued to run, but with weight all the more, She was weighed down with all of her treats galore that she lusted after in the colorful store. The little girl with long straight hair meditated on the man's warnings of snares. She continued her search for the great high priest that she might obtain a garment for the coming feast. Now back down the road was the weighed down girl, who had on her head hair that did curl. As she ran through the town looking for a garment, she grew very tired as the day was near spent. She saw to her right a soft bed for rest, and thought to herself, "Surely rest is best." She set her large purse of candy right down, and ceased her search of finding a white gown. She folded her hands and rested her eyes, but soon thereafter the tall man walked by. He woke her up and let out a loud sigh, then said, "The hour is approaching nigh. When the trumpet sounds and the feast begins, then those that are not washed and changed will remain in their sins. The hour is at hand, so run and search. You must find a white garment to be the church." The very tall man then went on his way, warning all of this coming hour and day. The little girl with curls then chose to arise, and then embraced her candy as her most precious prize. Meanwhile, further on down the road, was the diligent girl who was searching high and low. She determined that she would be in a white garment found when the feast commenced and the trumpet would sound. She set her heart to not be found in a snare, so much so that she ran past the toy store without care. She then passed the library and bakery too. All she desired was to find a white garment so new. She continued to search for the great high priest, asking those dressed in white from the greatest to the least. They all pointed her to a distant hill, so she continued to run with desperation and zeal. She climbed this hill with all of her might, so that she could be washed and receive a garment of white. And there at the top of this hill so grand stood the great high priest holding out his hand. There she received her garment of white, and was washed from her stains till clean in his sight. There on Calvary Hill with the high priest she rejoiced and wept, for she knew she was the least. She knew she never deserved such a gown, and not only the gown, but now he gave her a crown. She bowed at his feet and inquired of his will, while she spent this day on Calvary Hill. Then, as she continued her walk towards the feast, there was one last warning given by the high priest. He lovingly looked down at the girl dressed in white and said, "Be sure to stay clean, spotless, and bright. For if you stain or remove your garment of white, then you shall be shut out of the feast and thrust out of sight. But if you continue on the narrow way, then surely your garment of white shall stay." The little girl with long straight hair then replied, "By thy grace I shall escape each snare." She came down the hill and took the narrow path, but across the way she heard a familiar laugh. She looked on over the wall by the road, and saw her old friend weighed down with her load. With her saddened heart she asked her friend, "Do you now not want this great feast to attend? For the road you are on is broad and wide, and you have all these lusts weighing down on your side. Remember the warnings of the snares, and how you must find a white garment to wear?" The loaded down girl with curly hair, with more laughter said, "What a foolish garment you wear! I shall find my way to the feast just as you. Don't question my route." And from there she withdrew. The little girl with long straight hair wept and prayed for her old friend with sorrow and care. She then continued on the narrow path, enduring great persecution, slander, and wrath. Then, not too far down the narrow road, there was a mighty river that roared and flowed. There, in front of the great water's brim, there was a sign that said, "To the feast you must swim." And right thereafter on the other side, there was a gate with a sign that read, "Welcome, my bride." Beyond the gate was a feast so grand, it was more beautiful than any other could plan. The little girl with her spotless garment of white jumped in the waters and swam with one last fight. Determined to cross the current so strong, she swam to reach this feast for which she longed. After she defeated the water with joy and peace, she approached the golden gates, and from the race did cease. And there in the midst of this most beautiful feast stood a glorious king, the great high priest. His beauty was what made the feast so grand. He held out to the girl both his nail-pierced hands. With tears of joy and a thankful heart, she bowed before this king, now never to depart. Her crown she removed and laid at his feet. Her voice she lifted and sang of sin's defeat. She knew that she was unworthy to attend. She knew that only mercy had brought her to this end. The feast began and music played, but then, all of the sudden, the noise started to fade. There on the wall did the curly hair girl appear, trying to lift herself down to the feast so near. The great high priest spoke to the girl in sight and asked, "Why are you here without a garment of white?" The little girl with the orange curly hair stood speechless, while weighed down with her many snares. The great high priest then commanded his faithful hire to remove her at once, and they departed to the fire. For everyone that has been called to the feast must appear in a white garment, from the greatest to the least. Weeping Jane then looked at Judith Ann and said, "I'm in the same race that this little girl ran. I'm going to this feast, and by God's grace I too shall look upon my Savior's face." Dear little Judith, with her heart ablaze, still stared fast at Jane with an unmovable gaze. She said, "I too will attend this feast so grand. I shall search for this priest with the nail-pierced hands." Little Judith then searched with her whole heart for a garment of white, so that she might with Christ have part. She remembered the dream of Weeping Jane, and she determined to be as the faithful girl just the same.